Representative Johnson is going to fill in for Representative Kelly. And Representative Johnson, when you get there, we'll go ahead and move your bill.
Mr. Chair, where's this bill moving to from here?
Transportation.
I'll make the motion that 2690 be recommended and referred to transportation.
Okay, you have a couple of amendments. One you wanted to talk about. Representative Johnson.
The first amendment that I wish to talk about, I'm not going to offer this, but it does need to be talked about, is the enhancement of the penalties for people getting caught without having the ignition interlock device on their vehicle when they're required to. I was contacted by my county attorney, Jeff Edblad. They're starting to get a number of repeat offenders on this. I've also talked with through emails with Judge Dean from the 10th Judicial District, who was instrumental in initially getting the ignition interlock devices started, and actually was using them before it was statute. I think it's something that we do need to look about. I've talked with the County Attorneys Association about this issue for enhancing the penalties, and they are going to be discussing it at their next meeting. And at the chair's request, because I do not have their blessing at this time, I'm not going to offer this amendment.
Okay, and your other amendments you wish to offer?
The other amendment, number H2690, the A1-1. This change, this is a minor change to the bill. It makes it so the ignition interlock
Representative Johnson, we'll just offer it first, and then I'll let you explain it. Representative Johnson moves the A1-1 amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, now to your amendment bill. Thank you.
The amendment to the bill makes it so the ignition interlock device for DWI offenses is strictly used for alcohol-related offenses. In my career as law enforcement, I've had arrested many people for DUI, not just for alcohol, but also for narcotics, and even the tougher one to do is prescription drugs. For those that are convicted for drug-related DUIs, the only way they can be generally done is they have had no alcohol in their system, because if they're tested positive for alcohol, they do not do the test for the drugs in their system. So it kind of defeats the purpose. And we now have people who are getting narcotic and prescription DUIs able to get their license back just by having the ignition interlock testing for alcohol, which they were never charged with. So I think it's a good thing to get this on the bill so it's used in its proper way.
And excuse me for Representative Norton for not introducing you at the same time. And now, was that your description of the bill too then? And
But the bill also, what it does is it right now, if I remember correctly, it's 3 times before you interlock in 3 times in 5 years, or I believe 4 and 10, that you'd be able to, in order to get your license back, you'd have to have the ignition interlock device installed on your vehicle. This changes it to the second offense, and so so people can get their, you try to stop people from driving while drinking at this.
Representative Norton, before I introduce you, I wanted to acknowledge some of the people that are here today from the Greater Mankato Growth Leadership Institute in the crowd, quite a few people here, and welcome them, because I have to take off to do a bill in another committee pretty soon, so I just wanted to say hi and let's give them a hand for being here. So. And Representative Norton is going to speak to us about the bill. She has put a lot of hard work into this whole DWI issue here for the past couple of years. Representative Norton, glad to have you with us. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Representative Kelly asked me to just say a few words about ignition interlock in general, as I had another bill that I did in his committee already this year, and I think you guys have possession of that right now. I came to the issue of ignition interlock probably 11 or 12 years ago, before really anyone was talking about it, and that was because I went door knocking and I met a woman and she begged me, if I got elected, to go up and do something. And I said, well, I've never even heard of this. What is it? And she explained it to me, and basically, as her story goes, she said, my son needs ignition interlock. He has been arrested for multiple DUIs, and he just drives without his license, and I'm scared to death he's going to kill someone. And that was the first time I'd ever even heard of this issue. So since then, I have another constituent who testified in the Transportation Committee who lost a son, and Representative Cornish, and probably some others of you have heard from her. So I dug into this issue a little bit, and I'm just going to share a few data points here. In 2014, 25,258 people in Minnesota were arrested for DUI, 25,000. In 2012, more than 10,000 people died in alcohol-impaired driving crashes in the United States, which is once in every 51 minutes, according to the U.S. Department of Transportation. And in Minnesota, 31% of traffic deaths had alcohol involvement. That's 111 deaths in 1 year. 2,040 people suffered injuries, many of them very serious, from alcohol-related incidents. 25 states have now moved toward requiring interlock for all offenders, and that certainly, as the chair knows, and some of you may know, that's my preference. I think it's important to note that a high percentage of drivers whose licenses are revoked or canceled continue to drive, and that alone is the best argument that ignition interlock should be mandatory. On St. Patrick's Day, I was looking at my Twitter feed, and I guess it was the day after, and the department tracks this kind of information, and someone from I think the State Patrol tweeted that there were 462 drivers stopped in one county, Ramsey County, on that evening. 55 of them were driving with revoked licenses. 55. I mean, it's a huge percent of people that continue to drive. In fact, up to 75% of DUI offenders continue to drive illegally without their licenses. And it's a real problem. Ignition interlock is an effective way to reduce repeat drunk drivers. Some states are finding up to 50% reduction in drunk driving arrests as a result of ignition interlock use. There's widespread support. And I also wanted to mention more than 500,000 Minnesotans, 607,885, in fact, have DUIs on their driving record. It's 1 in 7 drivers in Minnesota has a DUI. 1 in 16 has 2 or more, and 1 in 35 has 3 or more. This is a significant issue. It can be reduced significantly. The states that have moved to more significant ignition interlock laws have seen significant reductions. We should move in that direction too, Mr. Chair. I think this bill doesn't quite go as far as I would like. I think it goes closer to something that this committee can support at this time, and so I'm going to ask for your support of Representative Kelly's bill.
Okay, thank you, Representative Norton. Questions, Representative Considine and Representative Hertaus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If these people are driving on suspended licenses, how are you going to get them to put an interlock system in their car?
Which one of you would like to answer? Representative Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, Representative Considine, in order for them to get their license back and have a valid license, they'd have to get the interlock device. They're still, if they do not want to get their driver's license back, they're still going to, unfortunately, be driving. But this way is to get them an opportunity to get their license back legally, so they can legally drive.
Representative Hertaus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Norton, Representative Johnson. I was looking through the bill trying to find if there was any provision that addresses the situation when many households or families have multiple cars. How do you address that issue in this bill? What do you do to prevent somebody who's had their license reinstated with an interlock in a car, but is that any requirement that all of the cars in that household be equipped with interlock?
Representative Johnson.
Mr. Chair, Representative Hurtas, the way this works is the person would only be able to drive the car that has the interlock. And that's the issue that I had that one amendment to deal with, and I'm still be working on that, trying to fine tune that and hopefully get that attached at a later time. But if the person who is required with the interlock drives any vehicle without the ignition interlock device installed, they're in violation of their license. They can get charged with that.
And that's existing law right now, right? This bill doesn't change anything?
That is existing law right now, but like I said, we're starting to get people with repeat offenses of that, and that's something we do need to deal with.
Representative Norton, you had something to add?
I was just going to kind of add a little bit of information here. You know, one of the things that we can, and I would suggest we should do, is require, if you require ignition interlock and not a work permit license, or not allow people to drive without, if a condition of release is that you get ignition interlock and there's a way you can check to see that they got it, that's a start. And that's one of the reasons I support the first offense rather than second. But even at a second offense, you could, you know, you're going to leave and you are required to go down and get that ignition interlock put in. One of the things that I did in my bill, and I don't think it's in Representative Kelly's, but something to consider, is, you know, what do you do when someone is caught driving another car? And one of the things that I tried to do was when you get stopped driving on a revocated license, currently it's a payable, and we were increasing that to a gross misdemeanor, requiring them to go before a judge. I think that would significantly help. Right now, in talking to the Department of Public Safety and a couple of the other departments that I met with over the interim, there are people who have glove compartments filled with payables that it doesn't get taken care of, and so we want to try to avoid that. I think it's something we should address.
Representative Hurtas, follow-up?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I've worked on this DWI issue for the last couple of years, and in my study of it, what I find problematic is there is a high percentage of people who, when charged, don't reoffend. But for that element that does reoffend, they have a problem, and it's an addiction problem. And for some of the victims who have lost loved ones, and for even family members who have had to deal with people who are repeat offenders, one of the themes I heard was the ability of our law enforcement to change the behavior and the treatment part of it. And so I also am concerned about people becoming felons and not changing the behavior. So I support this bill in that implementing interlock after the second one is an attempt to change the behavior more quickly than waiting till the third one and then have an offense and now you're a felon. So I think interdiction earlier in the process of what we have set up in a 4 and 10 kind of system is the right step to do. And just quickly, I know of one case where the family was trying very hard to deal with an individual in their family who was constantly drinking and driving, and he would get, and this goes back more than a decade, would just get his fingers slapped, and there was no progressively increased penalty for it happening, and only until he finally killed somebody on the road. Then he went to prison for 10 years. And then that finally changed his behavior. So if we can do things earlier in the process, I think is a positive thing.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Powell. Yeah, it wasn't a question, real briefly. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say, I think part of what ignition interlock does is a behavior modification. When you learn that you've gone out and you've only had 1 or 2 drinks, I believe there are some that are truly alcoholic, and that is what you're talking about. There are other people who just, it takes a while for them to understand what the level is of tolerance for their bodies, and they think they can drive. The ignition interlock teaches them as they go when they try to blow into it and say, oh, 3 is too much. And so I think that's one of the advantages. And plus, the ignition interlock it can be managed so that you have to be 3 months blowing into it without any register in order to get off. So you do learn. It does modify behavior.
Representative Howell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess where my concern is has the interlock technology gotten better? Because I've heard the horror stories of people blowing into these things when their cars are cold, things freeze up, and they can't get to work, and which then pushes them to do something even worse, which means drive another vehicle. And I've heard the horror stories, and the other side question I have after that is, how many different companies provide these? I mean, are we locked into a monopoly situation here, or how many different outfits provide these devices?
Good question.
Representative Johnson.
Mr. Chair, Representative Howe, things are getting better. When the interlocks first came out, the only facility that installed them or maintained them was in St. Cloud. And if you were in International Falls and had an interlock, you had to tow your vehicle down to St. Cloud to get fixed. That has changed. There's a lot more of these stations and these facilities across the state, so it's not nearly as bad. And the technology is getting much better than when we first started.
Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's not very comforting to me, and not very comforting to the folks that have to, as we increase the number of people that have to use these. And I guess I'm really worried about, because I do know someone that went through this process, and he struggled because he'd blow into it, then he couldn't get to work, and he had to try to find a way to get there. And yet he knew someone else that was charged in very similar situation, and that person chose not to do this and drive without a license and violate the law even worse. And when she got stopped, she got a little slap on the hand and continued to go. You know, the cost of him putting in the interlock compared to the cost of the fine of the person not putting it in, she had a much less fine than even the cost of installing the system. And hopefully this addresses that. And I think this is a step in the right direction, but I'm concerned that we're pushing these systems before the technology has gotten to the where it's not going to cause us more issues in the future. So I hope you're right. I just have some concerns when you say they're getting better. We may be a step ahead of technology, but I hope that you're correct. Thank you.
Representative Howe, we have somebody from the manufacturer here. Sir, if you give your name and your title, where you come from, I mean, in the business, and then make it brief, if you would.
Thank you, Representative Cornish, members of the committee. My name is Edward Cohen. I'm Vice President of Smart Start Minnesota. I'm also here on behalf of the Ignition Interlock, the Coalition of Ignition Interlock Manufacturers today. With respect to reliability, sir, generally, I would say that our studies indicate that we are at least 99.9% working on any given day. Cold weather can provide some challenges, just like it can to your car battery, to your car engine. We do see a little bit worse problems in the winter, but for the most part, ignition interlocks work. They work reliably every single day.
Okay. Questions from the group? Any other testifiers today? If not, and you want to renew your motion?
Mr. Chair, renew my motion that House File 2690 be recommended and moved on to transportation.
As amended.
As amended.
Okay, and thank you, Representative Norton, for appearing today and helping out, and your work on this issue. And Representative Johnson, thank you. You've heard the motion. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, thank you much.